9 years ago, under the eye of international inspectors, 8,000 spent nuclear fuel rods were stored in a cooling pond in Yongbyon, North Korea. Last December, the inspectors were expelled. US satellites saw the fuel rods being trucked away, and North Korea now claims they've already been reprocessed into weapons-grade plutonium.
Over the long term, it could be producing 30, 40 nuclear weapons a year. That's an incredible rate of production. Even more serious than that image, which is quite serious enough, is the image of North Korea selling fissile material or nuclear weapons to non-states, to terrorist groups, to Al-Qaeda.
That's precisely the threat George W. Bush claimed he was countering when he went to war against Iraq.
Everywhere that freedom arrives, humanity rejoices. And everywhere that freedom stirs, let tyrants fear.
But as yet, there's no sign that freedom is stirring in North Korea. And the tyrant Kim Jong-il will be a tougher nut to crack than Saddam Hussein. Put simply, America and its allies have three options for dealing with North Korea's nuclear ambitions. They can bribe it, or bomb it, or blockade it. And none of them is good. Each Anzac Day, they march as proudly as the veterans of the Kokoda Trail or Long Tan. But names like Kapyong and the Imjin River have never lodged in Australia's folk memory. The Korean War lasted 3 years and cost nearly 4 million lives, including those of 339 Australians. But the guns fell silent 50 years ago. The war is hardly remembered at all by young Australians today. The young Americans of the US Army's 2nd Infantry Division can't forget. Technically, the war is still not over. While their colleagues were massing in the Kuwaiti desert, they were training with live rounds on the wintry hills just south of the demilitarized zone that cuts the Korean peninsula in two.
We train all year long. We got to be ready to fight tonight, whether tonight is in the summertime, or the wintertime, or any time.
5 kilometers to the north across the zone is the Army of North Korea. More than 1 million men, 8,000 bunkered guns and rocket launchers, chemical and biological munitions. And now there's the threat of nuclear weapons too.
It's quite obvious that North Korea has nuclear capability. But that's not the point. The point is whether America believes North Korea has a nuclear capability or not.
In the bustling heart of Tokyo lives one of the few men in the outside world who can make any claim to speak for the isolated and enigmatic government of the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Officially, Kim Yong-chol is executive director of the Center for Korean-American Peace. Unofficially, he's regarded as an enthusiastic mouthpiece for the North Korean regime.
As you know, America is a country proclaimed use of pre-emption as a state policy. America is only superpower equipped with hundreds of thousands of nuclear weapons. So North Korea must need some strong, powerful, physical, military nuclear deterrence against America.
Mr. Curry. Comment for us, Mr.
At a meeting in Beijing 6 weeks ago, US Assistant Secretary of State Jim Kelly was taken aside by his North Korean counterpart. North Korea, he was told quietly, already has nuclear weapons and is well on the way to building more. Meanwhile, they had an official proposal to put.
They did put forward a plan that would ultimately deal with their nuclear capability and their missile activities, but they, of course, expect something considerable in return.
What the North Koreans expect are security guarantees, followed by diplomatic recognition and economic aid. And they want the payment up front.
If North Korea give up nuclear weapons program, America never give us food or money, nothing. America first show money, cash on the table, not under the counter, on the table. Then North Korea may consider, otherwise no.
North Korea's offer was described in Washington as almost absurdly unacceptable. In fact, the Bush administration has ruled out any direct bilateral negotiations between the United States and North Korea.
And the reason for that is because there's no price that we would be willing to pay, that they would be willing to accept to stop engaging in what they're doing with respect to the development of nuclear weapons. We've been through this once with the agreed framework, and they broke it.
The agreed framework was the deal Bill Clinton did to escape from a similar crisis 9 years ago. And in the Bush administration's view, Bill Clinton was conned. But the story began long before Clinton came to power. In the late 1980s, as the Soviet Empire began to crumble, American spy satellites passing over North Korea spotted disturbing activity 100 kilometers north of Pyongyang. There was new construction at the site of the country's only nuclear reactor in a river bend near the village of Yongbyon.
The one reactor they had was relatively small, but we saw larger ones under construction, which would have allowed them to cook up plutonium in large amounts, enough for 10 weapons per year perhaps. Then you would have to extract that plutonium from the spent fuel rods, and again we saw the buildup of this capacity as well, although still under construction.
Suspicion centered on a huge building 200 meters long with thick concrete internal walls, which the North Koreans said was a radiochemical laboratory. The suspicion only became certainty in 1992, when the North Koreans finally agreed to receive a delegation from the International Atomic Energy Agency, headed by none other than Dr. Hans Blix.
Well, first of all, I should say that we are not here on an inspection tour. We are here to familiarize ourselves with the nuclear program of your country.
They were taken to the vast 200-megawatt reactor under construction at Taichung, and the 50-megawatt reactor being built at Yongbyon. And most important of all, to the so-called radiochemical laboratory close by.
We certainly drew that it was a reprocessing plant. They didn't use that terminology, but as soon as I got out of Beijing and we had a big press conference, I used the term. I said, this is a reprocessing plant. The North Koreans didn't like that particular comment, but that's what it was, and that's what I said it was.
The IAEA inspections didn't go well. The inspectors felt they were being deceived. The North Koreans were indignant. Eventually they gave notice that in 3 months' time they would expel the inspectors and withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
It came to a head right when the Clinton administration was coming in the office, right there in January of 1993. It was the first crisis on the doorstep. And they chose to deal with this by negotiation, and I think it was the right choice.
Clinton appointed Bob Gallucci as America's chief negotiator. The immediate crisis was averted, but the talks dragged on without result.
I think that there's a remarkable similarity between the 1994 nuclear crisis, which got very dangerous, we almost got into a war, and the present crisis. And what's the same is, in both cases, the U.S. was trying to get North Korea to back down as a precondition for dialogue about normalizing relations. North Korea had to take the first step to show that we're the superpower.
In the 30 years that he's been covering North Korea as newspaperman, academic and unofficial envoy, Selig Harrison has paid 7 visits to Pyongyang. In his book Korean Endgame, he says America has to be prepared to match North Korean concessions step by step.
In their mind, they're entitled to have a nuclear deterrent against a country with 9,000 nuclear weapons. Therefore, if we want to get them to give them up, we've got to make reciprocal, synchronized, orchestrated agreements in which both sides are giving something up as you move toward denuclearization. The Clinton administration wouldn't buy that.
So we said we were now going to seek sanctions and return the issue to the Security Council. The North Koreans said that a sanctions resolution from the United Nations would be taken as an act of war.
Let me say that we have obviously reached a new stage here as far as the situation in the DPRK is concerned.
In the South Korean capital, Seoul, the American embassy was preparing to evacuate 100,000 US citizens. The city's 10 million South Korean residents had nowhere to flee.
Well, the atmosphere here in Seoul was very ominous. We were preparing for a possible war. People were stocking up profane gases, instant noodles, thinking that perhaps North Korea might invade South Korea because North Koreans were saying things like that they would set the entire Korean peninsula or South Korea into a sea of fire.
It was then and is today no idle threat. The South Korean capital lies just 50 kilometers south of the demilitarized zone between North and South.
North Korea has a massive array of artilleries and rocket launchers, as well as Scud missiles near the demilitarized zone. And if they start to fire all those artilleries and rocket launchers, then the metropolitan Seoul and other key cities will be within the target range of that massive firepower. So the damage would be enormous.
But then former President Jimmy Carter intervened. He'd been invited to Pyongyang by North Korea's aging great leader, Kim Il-sung.
There was a very substantial meeting in the cabinet room in Washington, chaired by the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State, and National Security Advisor. And in the middle of that meeting, in the morning, President Carter called the White House, and I spoke with him, and he indicated that there was a deal of sorts that Kim Il-sung would accept if we would return to the table.
Jimmy Carter had persuaded Kim Il-sung to freeze his nuclear program and allow the international inspectors to stay.
Is there going to be war there?
Not now. No, not now. Thank you.
4 months later in Geneva, Bob Gallucci signed the so-called Agreed Framework on behalf of the United States. In return for freezing all nuclear construction and reprocessing, North Korea was supposed eventually to receive 2 expensive light water reactors like these, paid for largely by South Korea. Meanwhile, America was to supply 500,000 tons of fuel oil each year. It was a deal Bob Gallucci is still proud of.
Had we not made that deal, that plutonium program would have put out enough material for 100 nuclear weapons by now. That didn't happen.
But 3 weeks after the agreed framework was signed, Bill Clinton's Republican opponents won majorities in both houses of Congress for the first time in 50 years. House Speaker Newt Gingrich thought the deal smacked of appeasement. Many of his followers agreed with him then and agree with him now. In 1994, Congressman Doug Berreiter was a member of 2 influential